3.2. Monitoring versus logging versus tracing. 3 complementary pillars. A new engineer joins a team that runs a large online system. On his first day, a senior colleague shows him something simple. They open a big screen in the office. It looks alive. Lines move. Numbers change. Colors shift. This, the senior says, is what tells us how the system feels. CPU load, response times, error rates, traffic volume. Nothing about individual users, nothing about specific requests, just trends, just signals, just the overall health. The engineer watches for a while and realizes something. This view doesn't explain why anything happens, but it tells you when something begins to drift away from normal. Later that week, a strange spike appears. Requests get slightly slower, not catastrophic, but noticeable. The screen shows the change instantly, so they dig deeper. This time, they're no longer looking at the big picture. They're inside the system, scrolling through lines of text. Logs. Each line is a small memory. A note about a decision the code made. A warning about an unexpected value. A record of an error that occurred only once. Each log entry is like a short message written by the system to itself. Tiny fragments. Individual thoughts. Sometimes useful, sometimes noisy. But when something strange happens, those fragments start forming patterns. They notice, for example, that right before the slowdown, a certain service began retrying a specific operation. Not constantly, just occasionally, but enough to create friction. The engineer starts to see the difference. Monitoring said, "Something is off." Logs whisper, "Here's what I was doing at the exact moment it went off." A few minutes later, the team takes one more step. They open a completely different view, not a screen full of numbers and not endless text, but a map. A single user request is traced across the system. It enters through one service, calls another, waits on a database, then travels further through several components. On that map, one section suddenly lights up. A call that should normally take a few milliseconds now regularly takes hundreds. The problem is no longer mysterious. They can see exactly which part of the journey is slowing everything down, and that is the moment when it finally clicks for the new engineer. Monitoring is like standing on a hill, watching the entire city. You see traffic jams forming. You see power grids under pressure. You notice trends, but not the individual stories. Logging is like walking through the streets and listening to conversations. You hear details, mistakes, explanations, emotions. Sometimes it's chaotic, but it's real. Tracing is like following one person from their home to their destination, step by step, through every building they enter. It shows the exact path and the precise place where time was lost. None of these perspectives replaces the others. If you only watch the hill, you miss the details. If you read only conversations, you drown in noise. If you follow just one person, you may miss the bigger picture. Together, they form something powerful. The ability to see a system from far away, up close, and across its entire journey, all at the same time. And when systems grow and incidents happen, that combination doesn't just help engineers debug, it helps them stay calm. Because instead of guessing, they can finally say, with quiet confidence, "We know what's happening, and we know where to look next." What that story really shows is this. In complex systems, we don't rely on one single way of seeing reality. We build 3 different lenses, and each one answers a different question. The first question is simple. Is the system healthy right now? That is what monitoring exists for. It watches the big picture. It tracks behavior over time. It shows when something drifts away from normal. Monitoring doesn't care about individual requests. It cares about patterns, rising latency, growing error rates, sudden drops in traffic. It gives us signals that something deserves attention, often before users even notice. The second question goes deeper.
What exactly was the system doing when things went wrong? That is the job of logging. Logs capture events, decisions, warnings, unexpected states, all the little details that explain behavior. They don't show trends, they show moments. Sometimes there are too many of them. Sometimes they are messy. But when they are written thoughtfully, they become a narrative of what really happened inside the code. And then comes the third question, the one that matters most when architectures grow. Where did this specific request actually spend its time? That is tracing. Tracing follows a single request across every service it touches. It shows the path, the timing, the hops, and the exact place where the slowdown appeared. It connects dots that monitoring and logs alone cannot connect. When these three lenses work together, something subtle happens. Incidents stop being mysteries. Problems stop being feelings. Discussions become clearer, calmer, and much more objective. Instead of asking, "What do you think is happening?" teams start asking, "What do the signals actually show?" And that shift from guessing to understanding is what makes modern operability possible. In practice, using these three lenses well is less about technology and more about discipline. Good monitoring starts long before an incident. It means deciding which signals truly describe the health of the system and resisting the temptation to track everything. A system drowning in irrelevant charts is not observable, it is just noisy. The goal is simple. When something changes, the graphs should make the question obvious, not harder. Good logging is about respect for the people who will debug the system later, which often means your future self. Logs should tell a story. They should explain decisions, not just print values. They should be structured, consistent, and written with the assumption that one day someone will rely on them while under pressure. Good tracing becomes essential as systems become distributed. When many services talk to each other, intuition alone stops working. Tracing gives you sequence and timing. But like everything else, it only works if it is applied consistently. If half the services trace requests and the other half don't, the journey breaks in the middle and the picture becomes incomplete. And perhaps the most important rule is this: none of these practices exist to make dashboards look pretty or to satisfy process checklists. They exist so teams can think clearly when something breaks. They exist so conversations move away from opinions and toward evidence. They exist so that failure becomes manageable instead of frightening. When monitoring, logging, and tracing are treated as everyday habits, not as one-off projects, the entire culture around operations changes. Deployments feel less risky. Investigations become faster. Teams argue less and learn more. Problems still happen, but they stop feeling like chaos and start feeling like solvable puzzles. That mindset is the real payoff. In real teams, these three lenses usually turn into three families of tools. For monitoring, teams pick tools that are good at watching trends over time. They collect metrics. They draw timelines. They answer the question, is the system healthy right now? That's why you will often hear names like systems that collect metrics and visualization tools that turn raw numbers into dashboards. They store time series data and let engineers see how something changed across minutes, hours, or days. What matters is not the brand. What matters is that the tool helps you notice drift before it becomes failure. For logging, teams use platforms that can handle millions, sometimes billions, of small text entries and still make them searchable. Developers send logs from every service into one central place. There, they can filter, correlate, and replay the story of what happened. These tools shine when you need to answer questions like, what did this service decide to do right before it failed? The best teams treat logging systems not as a trash bin, but as an organized library. They structure logs. They attach context. They write them as if someone will read them in the middle of the night. Because someone probably will. Tracing tools belong to a different world entirely. They don't care about all events. They care about the path of one request. A tracing platform stitches together the journey across services and shows exactly where time was lost. It builds diagrams of calls, latencies, and relationships, almost like an X-ray of the architecture while it is running. These systems become invaluable the moment your application stops being a single monolith and turns into a network of services. What's interesting is that mature teams rarely choose just one tool. They build an ecosystem. Monitoring points to the symptom. Logging reveals the context. Tracing exposes the path. And gradually the system becomes not only observable, but explainable. And of course, every company names different products. One prefers one metric stack, another prefers a different visualization layer. Someone else runs their logs in a managed cloud platform instead of on-premise. The details change. The principle does not. The question is never, which tool is fashionable this year? The real question is, can we see our system clearly when it matters? Teams that understand that distinction choose tools deliberately. They don't chase features. They build confidence. And that confidence is exactly what lets them move faster without feeling reckless. In the end, the big idea is simple. Modern systems are too complex to understand from a single angle. Monitoring tells us when the system is drifting away from healthy behavior. Logging tells us what the system was doing at the exact moments things went wrong. Tracing shows the journey of a single request and reveals where time was lost along the way. None of them is enough alone, but together they turn confusion into clarity. They replace guessing with understanding and panic with calm, structured thinking. That is why these three pillars sit at the heart of operability. When companies talk about this topic during interviews, they are rarely interested in whether you memorize tool names. What they really want to hear is how you think when something goes wrong. They want to see whether you understand that monitoring is about noticing change, not just drawing pretty dashboards. They listen for whether you treat logs as a story, not as a garbage can full of text. And they pay close attention when you describe tracing, because tracing shows whether you've worked with systems where requests travel across multiple services, and whether you know how to reason about them. What impresses interviewers most is when a candidate talks about incidents in a calm, structured way. Not "we rebooted the server and it worked," but something like, "we noticed the trend, we looked at the logs to understand behavior, and we used tracing to pinpoint the real bottleneck." That tells them something important. This person doesn't panic, doesn't guess, and doesn't fight symptoms. They look for signals, follow the evidence, and solve the right problem. In other words, companies aren't just testing knowledge. They are looking for engineers who can keep the system and the team calm when reality becomes messy. When teams finally learn to see what their system is doing, another question naturally appears. Not just what happened, but how good are we really? And how do we measure that? That's where the next topic begins. Metrics and the language we use to define reliability. SLI, SLO, and SLA. End of 3.2.